Thanks, Elaine, and good morning, everybody. You're all very welcome to Love Data Week and our first talk for Love Data Week. And this is our annual program of events each year at this time to celebrate data and everything you can do with it. And the theme this year is Data for Everyone. And we're delighted to welcome Dermot Lynott as our first speaker this week. And I'll let Dermot introduce himself. And he'll be talking us through the journey of a data set. So I'll hand over to you now, Dermot. Thank you.
Thanks, Fiona. Thanks, Elaine, and thanks to everyone at the library for putting all this together. This is my first Love Data Week at Maynooth. It's great to be involved. And the talk slides here you can get them in the link at the bottom, and I've posted it in the chat as well, so you can go there and download PDFs if you want. I'm going to talk about the journey of a data set and about some of the issues that people face when trying to share data, and some of the challenges and opportunities also that arise in kind of unexpected ways. So hopefully this will work. So, I mean, I think everyone loves data. Who doesn't, especially on Valentine's Day. But I think it's not enough to say it. You've got to show it in your actions. And I think sometimes a lot of people pay lip service to the idea that data is important, but you've got to be able to demonstrate this love in practical and demonstrable terms. So I think for me, there have been certain events in my research career that have pushed me to be more careful about how I share data and how I curate my own data. And a sense of shame has gone a long way for me personally. And in a couple of examples highlight this. One sticks in my mind when I had a request for some data for a set of studies I'd done, and I had to go and find them. And I realized that my house of data was in a bit of a mess. Basically, I couldn't find the files originally. It transpired that they were 2 laptops ago. So I had to find the old laptops, find the chargers, and make sure they could get up and running. Then when I did find the files, they had really useful names like finaldata.v2.final and cleandata.old, totally opaque. I didn't know what was inside the files from the outside. And then the cherry on top was that the file formats I'd use in many cases were using proprietary formats, so that they would only open with specific pieces of software. So I had a real challenge getting that data together in a format that I was able to share with someone else who could then go and use it themselves for their purposes. And I felt quite embarrassed about that. So there are a number of reasons why you might want to get your data house in order. And as I found, it can be very difficult to wrangle data together after the fact. So if you don't start a project with the idea that your data is going to be available and someone else might want to use this, it's going to be very difficult then to get it into that stage once you've collected it, and once you've been analyzing it and formatting it in different ways and moving it around into a way that's useful for you and your specific needs. They might not be as useful for other people. So the other reasons are outside your own personal advantages that might arise, are that we see increasing requirements to share data. So from funders and journals, if you look at criteria now for ERC grants, for example, there's a lot in there about open science generally, but also about sharing data, making it available, and so on. The other thing that I'll mention is that organizing and sharing your data can have unforeseen benefits, sometimes consequences, but I think also benefits. And of course, you avoid the shame and future embarrassment that I experience. So I'm going to talk about some of the positives of sharing data, and I'm going to talk about one specific data set that I was involved in creating, and how, not that it took on a life of its own, but the path that stemmed from the original data set was completely unforeseen, and we could not have predicted what would have happened and how other people may have used the data. So the data set itself isn't that important, the specifics of it, but just to give you a little bit of context, I do some work on language comprehension, and I'm interested in how people's sensory and motor experience is related to their ability to comprehend language. And this relates to kind of a classical distinction between abstract and concrete concepts, which is long exercised philosophers and psychologists. So we were looking at how different concepts are experienced through different senses. So, for example, anger here, how we experience it through audition, gustation, haptics, olfaction, through the visual modality. And we collect a set of norms that dealt with some issues that previous measures had. And we collected these because we had planned a bunch, 5 or 6 studies, that we needed this data to create materials for those studies. So that was the only real reason we needed to collect the data. But once we had collected it, we decided, well, we'd gone to an awful lot of trouble to collect this. We didn't see any similar data out there, so we thought we should write this up, and we did. We published it as a journal article in itself in 2009, and then made the data publicly available. So after that, what we found is that as we were writing up the studies that came, that were built on the data set, that of course we were able to cite the original data set, and so we were contributing to our own citation metrics, which is always useful for things like well, jobs and promotion and things like that. Then that because we were getting some mileage out of that, we actually extended the data set a few years later, and we also published that as another journal article showing that we were extending the original one. And what we found over these intervening years, that were many other people were starting to use the data set as well, but in ways that were not on our horizon at all, and things that we would never have considered using it for. And at the moment, we found that dozens of other labs have used the original data set. It's been translated into about 7 different languages, most recently a new data set in Mandarin that I just saw the other day. People have applied it in areas like robotics and machine learning, which we wouldn't have done, and applied it in really novel ways, like using it to identify markers of depression in Alzheimer's writing. So looking at changes in the use of perceptual language over time. One researcher found that for a particular author, they found that there were markers in the language they were using about 10 years before their Alzheimer's was actually diagnosed. It was a really clever application, and it would have been totally outside the scope of our own research. Recently, I saw a linguist has written a book that's basically an homage to the original data set, and doing a linguistic analysis of perceptual language. So it's really nice to see the wide range of ways people have used it. And then on a personal level, the wide use of the data set was really useful for us when we went to apply for additional grants, and it really formed a cornerstone for successful funding applications to the Leverhulme Trust and to the ERC by my colleague Professor Louise Connell, who's also in psychology in Maynooth. In the grant, it was really important to show that this data had potential, and to show that others were making use of it as well. And on the basis of the grants that we've received, we've been able to create what's now the largest ever set of semantic norms for English. And we would not have been able to do that had we not been able to demonstrate the utility of the original data set and show all these other citations now. And among the collection of papers that we've written about them, there's probably been about 1,000 citations. So that's, you know, had a big impact personally for me and on my career trajectory. And, you know, 10, 12, 13 years on, we still can't predict how this data is going to be used. And so obviously we've seen that this data has been on a bit of a journey. And when you can see that, you might want to think about, well, how can I make my own data travel further? And there are a few really simple things I think that almost anyone can do to help your own data on that journey. So things like storing your data on a permanent repository. That's really important. So things like the Open Science Framework or Zenodo, so you know that your data will be there for, you know, a long, long time. OSF has a guarantee at the moment of that your data will be there, say, for 50 years, Zenodo even longer, I think. What happens when you do that is you can also make your data set on its own a citable reference. So even if you don't write it up as a journal article, you can give it a DOI, then you and others can cite it in papers, and then you get rewarded by your citation counts increasing. It's also useful to use suitable licenses to make it as available as possible. So some Creative Commons licenses like CC BY. That means anyone can use it in any way they want. They don't have to ask your permission, but they do have to cite you. So then you get some payback for people making use of your data set, but also you're not being harassed by people emailing you for the data, because they can just download it and use it as they see fit. I think, as I found, it's really important to make your data available in as basic a format as you can, and as raw a format as you can. So using plain text files or comma delimited files that can be opened up by any statistical or spreadsheet packages. Added value can be gained by providing some additional information about the data set. So providing some metadata, providing some code books that just provide verbal descriptions of what's in the data sets. You can even go further. Some people provide like how-to video guides or text documents about how you can approach the data, different ways you can use it. Providing the analysis script so people can reproduce your original analysis or apply it to a new set of data. All of these things can help your data go further than you might have expected. And this can lead to your data being used in a range of ways that you might not have predicted. So data can end up being used in meta-analysis, so where people are collating lots of data from different sources to estimate, an overall effect for a field or subdiscipline or a particular intervention, for example. Your data could be used for simulations to generate new data as a test bed for testing theoretical predictions. It can be used to generate new materials or new stimuli, or as an impetus to apply it to a new language or new domain. Can be used to give evidentiary support for examples. And what you might find is that it's picked up by people interested in policy, for example, who often don't necessarily work in universities and then don't have access to full text journal articles. But if your data is visible and freely available, then it's usable by them. And there are a whole host of potential advantages that people mightn't be foremost in people's minds. So there are selfish reasons for sharing, because it might increase your citations, and when you need to dig up your data, it's often easier to just go to the Open Science Framework or somewhere else and see all your data there than trying to find an old laptop that might contain your original data files. So of course you get more exposure for your work because it's more visible, you get more citations, but also practitioners are able to apply your findings. As I mentioned, your research may be able to influence policy because it's more visible as well. Also, in an era where citizen science and citizen engagement has become more important, your data is out there now, and anyone who has basic skills can access the data and make use of it. It's also become increasingly a requirement, as I mentioned, with funders and journal publishers, so that on acceptance of your article, you often now have to say, yes, this data is freely accessible. It's become less acceptable to say data is available upon reasonable request, upon emailing the author, who will reply within 6 months to 1 year, if at all. Journals and funders really want to see value for their money as well. And of course, value for money is important because for a huge proportion of researchers, your research and your salary and the data collection costs are being funded by the taxpayer. So according to the EU in 2020, open data has saved about 1.7 billion euros per year by reducing the needs for recollecting data and so on. And even if you think about it locally, if you think about an individual, say a senior researcher working for 1 year, salary costs and equipment costs alone could be about 100,000 euros. And if they've just collected a large data set over the course of that year, if they've not made it publicly available, then it stops there, and the life or half-life of that data set becomes very, very short. So we want to, maximize the value of the data for ourselves, but also for taxpayers and funders and so on. And you don't know how other people are going to use that data it could be in extremely innovative ways that you couldn't have foreseen. I think a final issue that's become really important is in terms of equality of access to data. So researchers in developing countries not only can they see your work, but they can use your data as well. And often in developing nations, the cost of data collection can be really prohibitive, and also they may not have the resources to collect appropriate data. So if they can apply or reuse data that's already in existence, then that allows them to develop research programs, interventions, policies in their home countries as well, without the added costs. And again, they could be applying them in contexts that you couldn't have predicted. So you can see that in this way, the journey of your data set can actually be extremely, extremely long. And the data can keep giving long after you've finished with it. So ideally, you want to leave it in a state so that people can make the most of it. And I'll finish with this slide that I often use, which is, people saying, what if it's a big hoax and we create a better science for nothing? And I think that's often the issue, that sometimes we see the challenges with increasing transparency and things like data sharing or increasing reproducibility and so on, because we don't immediately see the benefits for ourselves, but we're creating a better research environment and increasing transparency, and that's good in itself, even if we don't have all of these other potential benefits and benefits that we can't predict. And so I'm going to stop there, and thank you all for your attention.